Hey, everybody, and welcome to our first webinar of the season. This was recorded earlier today with Alison and Craig Snyder regarding the Autism CARES Act. I am after the fact adding this intro because I forgot to press record when I did the live intro. This is going to be uploaded to our website as a webinar, and it also on our podcast series, Autism Confidential. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the speakers because I neglected to include that in the recording. Alison is the president of the Autism Science Foundation. She is also on the board of NCSA. We're grateful for that. She is mother to Jody, who is a young woman with profound autism. Craig Snyder is a federal policy lobbyist who has worked on autism issues, as you will hear in the recording, for a very, very long time, really at the dawn of the Autism CARES Act, when it was the Combating Autism Act. He's based out of Philadelphia, and he is now working with Alison on these matters for Autism Science Foundation. We had a few things referenced, including a white paper from Autism Science Foundation about the Autism CARES Act, also NCSA's position on it, and a letter that we wrote to the co-sponsors, or who we think will be the co-sponsors, and all those links I will put in the show notes. Anyway, this is the launch of what will be a very glorious webinar season for us. And I hope that you will join us for what looks like will be 8 webinars through the end of spring. Did I say 10? There will be 10. And they're all going to be magnificent. So check that out at ncsautism.org/webinars to learn all the details. With that, I am going to turn it over to this webinar about the Autism CARES Act. Adios. So what we're going to do in this webinar is Alison and Craig will speak, and they're going to let you know what you need to know about the CARES Act. And then we will, at the end, hopefully have a discussion, a Q&A. If you have questions you want to submit during the discussion, that's fine. And I will, if I have to interject and get some clarifications, I absolutely will. The chat is also open. I don't guarantee I'll monitor chat, but I'll definitely monitor Q&A. So feel free to ask anything. We hope there is a lively discussion. This is a very important issue. This is a big bill that will govern the federal government's efforts with regard to autism for a while. And so we have to get it right. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Craig. Craig, please go ahead.
Thank you, Joe, and thanks everybody for joining this evening. Why should we care about the Autism CARES Act? Because it is the constitution of federal autism policy. It is the central organizing authority and the basis for the funds that are provided for most federal activities on autism, particularly with respect to scientific research. And it is expiring. The bill is expiring this year and needs to be either renewed, changed, scrapped, whatever Congress ultimately decides to do. And of course, our job, as Jill said, is to help them get it right. So we wanted to start with some history for context, really, on this very important 2024 process regarding federal policy on autism. As Jill said, I've been at this a really long time. In 1997, almost 30 years ago, I was the chief of staff to U.S. Senator Arlen Specter, who at the time was the chairman of the Appropriations Subcommittee that funds the Department of Health and Human Services and all of its parts, including the NIH and the CDC. In that role, as the senator's chief of staff, a big part of my job was to meet with advocates, numerous advocates who came day after day seeking almost always more money and more attention from the federal government on all manner of different issues, diseases, disabilities, things that I had never heard of, but there were people suffering and they wanted their government to get involved. It was a deeply moving process, sometimes a very frustrating process because you knew that you couldn't satisfy everybody. You couldn't do everything that really ought to be done. Sometimes it was a blurry process. But one day, a contemporary of mine, a guy who at the time was a Hollywood movie producer, but originally from my hometown of Philadelphia, came to our office and told me really for the first time about autism. His 2-year-old son had just been diagnosed. And when it happened, some of our country's most highly respected pediatricians working in one of our country's most prestigious hospitals had said to John Shestak and his wife, Portia Iverson, when they asked, okay, what do we do now? What do we do after this diagnosis? These prestigious doctors had said to John and Portia, go home, hold each other, and pray. Not only did that strike me as just almost unbelievable in the late 20th century that was all medicine had to offer, but it struck me as a kind of a cop-out, a kind of a failure on the part of the medical establishment. Not only did John and that story about his son Dove really capture the abysmal state of medical science regarding autism, but John also was able to see and to document in the early days the beginnings of the very sharp and unexplained rise in the incidence of autism that was really happening at the time. He would tell people, anybody who would listen all the time, he would say, if you don't know someone with autism, you soon will. And my Lord, was he right. At the time when I started talking to people about this experience and this new knowledge that I had gained, most of the people I talked to did not have a family member diagnosed with autism. Can't say that today. Can't say that today. The change has been stunning and obviously in the wrong direction. The third thing that John had done in those early days was his policy homework. He would get up at 5 a.m. California time and call on the old-fashioned landline the policy offices and the public affairs offices at each of the constituent parts in the NIH, and he would say, "What are you spending on autism?" At the time, nobody had that statistic, believe it or not. The federal government couldn't answer the question, how much are you spending on autism? No one knew. But John sort of pieced it together. And the answer was astonishing. $5 million a year. $5 million out of the vast sums that the federal government was spending even at that time on medical research. So the following year, I left government service, became a lobbyist, and my very first client was John and Portia's organization called Cure Autism Now. Some of you may have been around long enough to remember that organization. And I want to pause on the name because at the time, we did not think of it as sort of bravado or just marketing. We had a goal, and the goal was cure autism now. We were technological optimists. We believed that in the wake of two things that at that time were very recent. One, the completion of the Human Genome Project, this fabulous new science of genetics, and the emergence of the internet, which of course at the time we thought could only be a good thing. I mean, what could go wrong with that, right? That these new technologies were going to allow us to get the answers to the fundamental questions about autism. What are the causes? How can this thing be treated? How can it potentially be cured or prevented? The initial lobbying efforts that we launched, late 90s, early 2000s, met with great success. We led a coalition which successfully passed a bill called the Children's Health Act of 2000, which had as its #1 title, it's the first chapter of the bill, was dedicated to autism, which made it the first legislation, the first federal legislation that actually touched on autism. And that bill created centers of excellence for research, and it began to require for the very first time that the CDC would do epidemiology on autism, that we would begin to actually assess the prevalence in the country in a scientific way. It was a good victory, but we knew that we'd barely scratched the surface. What we wanted was a dedicated entity in the federal medical research complex to be created and to be given responsibility for, well, the goal, cure autism now. We were told that that was impossible, that getting a bill that was about autism and only autism was just impossible, because there was this bipartisan agreement. Republicans and Democrats disagree on everything, but they agreed on this, and that was that Congress should never pass what they called a single disease bill. There was this consensus among legislators that if they passed a bill about one malady, they would end up having to pass a bill about every malady, and there are thousands of them, and it would just that would overwhelm the Congress, and it would overwhelm the taxpayers, and it was just impossible. So it couldn't be done. That's what we were told. But we didn't take no for an answer. We worked on it and worked on it. It took years. But ultimately, we succeeded in passing the first single disease bill in the history of the United States, which was the Combating Autism Act of 2006. It was landmark legislation because it dramatically increased the level of federal resources, the amount of money that was being spent, and because by virtue of its coming into being, it was a declaration by Congress and the president who signed it that autism was a national public health priority, that this was a real problem, and that it needed to be addressed at a national level. But there's always a but in life. There's always a but in Washington. We had to make compromises in order to get that bill passed. In a number of sort of crucial details, we had to back off of our original kind of grand vision. The most important of those was we had to give up on the idea of this independent autism research office, which we wanted to be modeled on the very successful Office of AIDS Research, which had been created back in the 1980s, because the Congress of the time simply was unwilling to add any new entities, any new divisions, if you will, to the NIH. And so we ended up replacing the idea of this independent office, which would have very significantly would have budget authority, it would control the spending on autism research. We ended up having to agree to replace that with a committee that would make recommendations, but would not have authority over spending. And that committee was and is the Interagency Autism Coordinating Committee. There are lots of problems with the IACC and the way that it has functioned on autism. I'm going to turn it over to Alison in just a minute to talk more about that, because she has the most experience of any person in America on the subject. But the most important problem I want to highlight again is that this is a committee that makes recommendations. It does not have authority to control spending. So even if it came up with all the right answers, which it certainly hasn't, but even if it did, that would be, sort of words in the wind, because the federal bureaucracy responds really only to one thing, and that is the purse strings. So this bill, which passed in 2006, has been reauthorized because one of the things that we I think did correctly in the bill was we put a sunset provision in that this thing would expire after a certain number of years, and Congress would have to reconsider it. I think it's a good thing because the idea is you look at what has worked and what hasn't. You make corrections, you make changes. You always try to improve the policy so that the taxpayers are getting the best benefits, and the constituents that it's aimed at, in this case, the autism community, are really getting the value for the legislation. Well, the bill has been reauthorized in 2011, in 2014, and again in 2019. But in all of that time since 2006, there have not been any fundamental changes, any material changes, much less improvements. The biggest change was the name. And from my point of view, that was the opposite of an improvement. We went in 2014 from Combating Autism to this acronym of Autism CARES. I've never been sure what exactly autism is supposed to care about. But what happened by 2014 was a change in American politics, in American political culture. And it was no longer politically correct to talk in terms of combating autism. Autism as a problem to be solved had become politically dangerous for members of Congress, or so they thought. And so they changed the name. How did that happen? Well, you had the emergence of the neurodiversity movement. And that fundamentally changed the landscape. And those suffering from what we now call profound autism, severe autism, and all those who love them got drowned out, pure and simple, in a wave of self-advocacy, advocates who described autism not as a medical problem, but rather as an expression of human diversity to be honored and treasured. So I'm going to stop. I'm going to turn it over to Alison at this point to talk about her years of working on how she tried to execute this bill once it became law, and then we go to where we are today.
Thank you, Craig. So in 2006, when the Combating Autism Act was passed, as Craig said, the intention was to combat autism or to fight against autism. That was the congressional intention. And so in 2006, when the first IAC was commissioned, the first thing it did was to meet in retreat for 4 days in Northern Virginia, where scientists from all over the country came together to talk about the research that would be necessary to make real inroads against autism as a debilitating medical condition. And from that 4-day meeting came the Autism Strategic Plan, the IAC Strategic Plan. So the legislation, the Combating Autism Act, requires the IAC to write a strategic plan every year. I would argue that that was the only year that we actually wrote a strategic plan. Every year after that, it's just updated. But that was a significant investment of time, of expertise, to really draft a plan that would make inroads. Unfortunately, from that point on, things just never really we were not able to implement the intention of Congress because of what Craig described as the changes in the political landscape. I would argue that the biggest change in the political landscape came when the DSM-4 was changed to the DSM-5. In the DSM-4, we had 5 definitions of autism that ranged from Asperger's syndrome to classical autism, and then pervasive developmental disorder in the middle. Right? So classical autism is probably what we now call profound or severe autism, Asperger's syndrome, I think we all know Asperger's syndrome. And then for those kids who were kind of in the middle, we used pervasive developmental disorder, not otherwise specified. And research against a strategic plan started to happen until really 2013, when the DSM-4 was changed to DSM-5, and all of those different subtypes of autism were collapsed into autism spectrum disorder. From that point forward, everyone was diagnosed the same, autism spectrum disorder. So, you can be diagnosed ASD if you have IQ of 50 or IQ of 150. You're diagnosed ASD now if you have abundance of language or no language, if you have self-injurious and aggressive behaviors, or if your social behaviors are challenges navigating the middle school cafeteria. So, at this point, I'm sure everyone on this call has experienced this. When I tell someone new that my daughter has autism spectrum disorder, their expectation is that she's very high functioning, because the result of collapsing this definition was that people who themselves were diagnosed ASD were able to speak for themselves. And frankly, under the Obama administration, there was this movement that we should listen directly to patients. They wanted to hear from people who had, quote, lived experience. And unfortunately, that did not include parents of profoundly affected people with autism. It included only the higher functioning self-advocates who were able to speak for themselves, come to policymaking committee meetings, and join the IACC. And then it was that rise of the neurodiversity movement that, as Craig said, led to the change in the name of the bill from Combating Autism Act to Autism CARES Act. And the composition of the IACC, which previously had included public members who were parents, now shifted to include a majority of public members who were self-advocates. And as a result of that, the type of research that the IACC was recommending in its strategic plan changed from a focus on underlying biology to a focus on improving the lives of people who are alive now. And no one is saying that that research is not also important, but the intention of the bill at its inception was to get at the underlying biology of autism. And because of the collapse, because of the collapse of the 5 different types of autism into one title, ASD, because of the rise of the neurodiversity movement, our children have been left behind, right? So we are now trying to move forward for the reauthorization in 2024 to bring back the original intention of the 2006 bill and concentrate at least some of the funds, earmark some of the funds for what they were originally intended, which was to combat autism, to focus on understanding the underlying biology that causes autism and develop targeted treatments so that our children can be better off, so that no one again will experience, what many of us on this call have experienced, where you take your child to a doctor and they just want to throw a little Prozac at her. We have to understand the biology so that our interventions are scientifically sound. And that won't happen unless research is done focused on our population. In fact, the neurodiversity movement has been so strong at the NIH that most of the research done at the NIH now officially excludes our children, because that research requires participants to have IQ of 70 or above. Now, by definition, profound autism, according to the Lancet, is autism with IQ of 50 or below. And we know that 27% of people diagnosed with autism meet the definition for profound autism, have IQ below 50. We also know there's a large number of people who have IQ between 50 and 70 who are also excluded from research. So right now, at present, the research being done by the NIH excludes our children. So if they're not included, they can't participate in those studies, then the findings of those studies don't apply to them. And that's also why we're seeing a shift in the type of research that's being funded. And our goal with the reauthorization is to swing the pendulum back, at least for some of the funds to be earmarked for those who have the greatest needs, the most debilitating medical forms of autism. I think with that, I'm supposed to hand it back to Craig,
So
according to our outline here.
exactly. So the bill expires on September 30th. That's our runway between now and then. It's our belief that the deficiencies in the bill's structure and in its execution by the bureaucracy that Alison has described are so severe that it would actually be better to let the bill expire than to simply renew it in its current form and sort of rubber stamp the status quo. There are members of Congress who would like to sort of claim another victory for themselves and allegedly on behalf of the autism community and pop another bottle of champagne because they renewed this bill yet another time. But we're determined to fight for fundamental revision in the way that Alison has described. And in many ways, go back to the original vision of the purposes of federal autism policy and the processes that are necessary to realize that vision. So we are in the process of developing our own version of what the bill should be, what the words should be in the law. We want to take another run all these years later at the creation of an autism research office in the NIH, modeled on the Office of AIDS Research. We'd also like there to be an Office of National Autism Policy in the White House so that there's true collaboration and coordination across the whole of government. Because autism affects, in one way or another, every government agency. It affects the Department of Defense. It affects the Bureau of Corrections that runs the prisons. There's really no agency of government that isn't touched by autism in some way, because there are many people in the country facing autism, and they interact with government all across government. So there needs to be a whole of government approach in addition to the medical research that is required.
I want to stress something, Craig, that you said at the beginning of this paragraph, because it addresses what Robert Titus has put in the Q&A, which is that the current bill as is worse than no bill, because our children are left out of it, right? So you will hear, as Robert Titus posted in the Q&A, that some federal agencies are saying that the profound autism movement is endangering the Autism CARES Act. Yes, that's the goal. That's the goal. Because the current bill leaves our children behind. It excludes them from research. We have to have a bill that at least recognizes that our children exist and that they also deserve attention and research. And frankly, if the neurodiversity community had advocated for this end of the spectrum, we wouldn't be here. But it's a lot of it is because the current neurodiversity advocates who are on the IAC actively advocate for policies that harm our children, right? So, and again, when people push back against this, and you will hear this in the community, and people say, oh, you're putting the bill at risk. As Craig said, it's much easier to just do what they call it, and I've learned this from Craig, a dates and dollars. Just reauthorize, change the date on the bill, add the inflation money in there and say, great job, everyone, pass the champagne. That's not what we want. We want radical change because our children deserve and need radical change. They need to be included. And if the neurodiversity community had advocated for policies that supported them, we wouldn't be here, but they actively advocate for policies that harm them. And so we have to step up and we have to have a new bill.
I think you've stated it really, really well. I mean, yes, first of all, we want more money. Because the amount that's being spent per capita on autism research at this point, as the autism numbers have continued to skyrocket, it's now back to almost as bad as it was 30 years ago when those first numbers were collected that I talked about at the outset. So more money, yes. But if that money continues to be allocated exclusively, as it is now, towards research on quality of life issues for the highest functioning folks, That is not an appropriate use of taxpayer dollars. If you stopped somebody on the street and you said to them, should we have a community of people with greater needs and lesser needs. Where should we put the money? Every ordinary American on the street would say, put the money toward the greater needs. It's not complicated. In fact, it's the opposite. In reality, it's the opposite is being done. The funds, limited as they are being put towards folks with the lesser needs rather than the greater needs.
And we're not saying that the profound autism community should have all the money.
Exactly.
I think, and we're not saying that people who are higher functioning don't have needs. We're saying that their needs are different and that both groups need to be represented. I think we have to get to the point where we in America are able to hold two simultaneous truths in our mind at the same time, that autism can be a wonderful gift for some people, and for others, it is a debilitating medical condition that requires intervention and treatment. Both of those things can be true, and both of those constituencies need to be represented in this legislation.
That's exactly right. It shouldn't be an either or situation. It shouldn't be a competition for resources or a measuring of comparative suffering. It should be that the different needs are differently and appropriately addressed as a matter of policy. And that's really what we're fighting for. It's a course correction to allow for that appropriate discretion. Now, the problem is that there are, as there always are in Washington, there are powerful forces behind the status quo. Once something is in place and has been in place for a number of years, there are people who benefit from it, and they always fight to maintain the status quo. There are some other autism organizations, as Alison has said, that believe that essentially any bill is a good bill and that you can't put having a bill at risk. There are, of course, the neurodiversity advocates themselves who oppose our orientation on this question of medical research. They oppose it ideologically, and they also oppose it in terms of the distribution of funds. And then there are members of Congress themselves, as I said earlier, who would just like to take the easy way out, change the dollars, change the date, declare victory, and go on to the next issue, rather than do what the sunset provision in the bill was intended to do, which is go back to the drawing board, see what works, save it, see what doesn't work, fix it, improve it. That's what the process is supposed to be about on legislation. Now, so we have powerful forces against us. On the other hand, and I'll finish up in just a second, Jill.
No, go ahead.
On the other hand, the idea of profound autism and the idea that there is a profound autism community is gaining traction. And I look both to Jill and to Alison and to others, I'm sure, on this call and beyond it, for fighting this fight, for creating. There's been a large series of stories in the mainstream media over the last year. There continue to be, I would say, sort of a rising current of awareness, and there's a substantial group of grassroots constituents, and you all on this call are the pointy end of that spear in terms of people who want better policy and who are prepared to tell their congresspeople to represent them, which is, after all, what their job is supposed to be, to represent them and to get this thing right this time. So what we're doing now, as I said, we're drafting the bill that we would like to see passed. You can't beat something with nothing. You have to have the alternative. And we're in the process of identifying new friends, new champions on the Hill, who we believe will support our efforts, particularly with your help and the help of people like you, who will reach out to their congresspeople, let them know that it's absolutely vital that this bill be passed in a new way, that it include profound autism, that it recognize profound autism, and that the improvements that need to be made in federal policy and practice on autism are in fact made. So that's where we are.
Well, I think you missed one thing, which is
Yep.
ahead of our bill language. What we have done already was write a white paper.
Yes.
And a lot of that was spearheaded by Kimberly Dick and Judith Orsini from the Profound Autism Alliance, who are amazing advocates. So I think when those of you who are writing in the chat that you've already heard that people are saying the profound autism community is putting the bill at risk, it's because we announced ourselves with that white paper that this was our intention. We plan to be disruptive. And I think that has done the job. I mean, clearly people are aware of our position. I think they probably know that a bill is coming, and that we're not going to be quiet, that we are going to be fighting for our children and for what they need. But that white paper has been circulated to Chris Smith's office, to Senator Menendez's office, to the co-sponsors on the House side, to the co-sponsors on the Senate side. And we have been having meetings with congresspersons on the relevant committees on both the House and Senate side. And Judith has done a lot of those meetings as well. And we are going to continue to do those. I think where we will need help is once we introduce the bill language, once the bill is introduced, you never know which congressional office is going to reach out, who's going to ask questions, who's going to want more information. And it's always better if we can bring a constituent, or a constituent from that congressperson's office can write the letter. So, we don't know at this point. And I remember this when we did the original Combating Autism Act. You never know which congressperson, whose district you're going to need help in. But I think the goal is to get ready now, and to create lists now, and for everyone to become informed about the process now. Because when those issues come up, they come up quickly, and we need to respond quickly. So that was one of the reasons why we asked Jill if we could go first, because we wanted everyone to be informed about this legislation as early as possible, so we can provide you with whatever information you need, so that when the time comes, we can reach out to whoever it is who's in that district and get help.
Exactly.
Okay, well, thank you. I have a lot of questions and there are some questions in the Q&A, so that this might take a while. But first of all, my first question is, in terms of process, the bill has not yet been introduced, as you just said. Could you give people a little bit of a timeline? Like, what do you think is going to happen? Obviously, there is a looming deadline of September 30th. Even if they don't make September 30th, I guess it could go beyond that. But can you give people a sense of timing here moving forward?
So I'm sure everybody on this call has been watching Congress in its other activities recently, and so and I smile as I say this, but not really. The institution is pretty broken, and the ability to do things in what is formally called regular order has really broken down. So it makes the process very unpredictable, I'm afraid to say. That's just the reality. The bill, our version of the bill, has not been introduced. A bill was introduced by Congressman Smith in the House last week, but it has not been published. It is not public. So we don't know officially what it says yet. We can surmise from everything that we've been told that it is what's called a straight reauthorization, without any substantial changes, without the improvements that we wanted to have. So technically, the ball has started rolling. The bill was introduced, which means it's referred to the committee. The committee can act on it at any time, but is very unlikely to do so for the next several months. First of all, because the companion bill has not been introduced in the Senate yet. And although they don't have to move in lockstep, they also don't want to move, sort of dramatically separate from each other. And the bill has no co-sponsors. So Congressman Smith introduced the bill. himself alone, which has never happened before. In the previous reauthorizations, the bill was sort of shopped around to the whole Autism Caucus and indeed to the whole House of Representatives, and was introduced with dozens, if not scores, of co-sponsors. This time it was introduced just by the congressman himself. I believe that that's because there's an effort to sort of head us off at the pass, just speaking frankly about this, an effort to make it more difficult for us to get an alternative considered. But we're not going to let that happen. We do have friends on these committees who I believe are going to be willing to tell the chairs of those committees that it's premature to bring up a bill that hasn't been seriously considered and where alternatives haven't been looked at. So long-winded answer, and it's not even an answer because you asked for a timeline. And the bottom line is that there just isn't one. The likelihood, and certainly based on past precedent, is that the likelihood is that if the bill gets passed, it will be on the 29th or 30th of September. That is the likelihood. It has happened right near the deadline every time so far. As they say in investments, past performance, no guarantee of future results. So you can't assume that because it was that way before, it will necessarily be that way again. But that is the greater likelihood that we have, basically a runway between now and the end of September.
Thank you. We're going to go to questions in 1 sec. There are two little things I wanted to mention, which is sometimes when I talk about this bill with people, they kind of like, they tend to lose a little bit of interest in that they see autism research as something a little bit divorced from what's most important to them. What's most important to our people are like making sure that they can get access to doctors and medicines and make sure that they can get supports, whether they're in-home, residential care, day programs, etc. Those are the things we hear the most. When we talk about CARES and they're like, that doesn't affect what I need now. I am not getting what I need now. How do you respond? What in CARES should our constituents really care about? What is going to make their lives, make their children's lives better?
So I understand how challenging the time is when you are the parent of a child with profound autism. And I understand how difficult it is to get services in place and to find the services and then pay for the services. I think, though, we have to think back to where we were in 2006 to where we are now in 2024, where many of the services that parents are trying to access, many of the medications that parents are trying to see psychiatrists to get, didn't exist because they are the product of the research that was done under the Combating Autism Act. So all of the studies of applied behavior analysis to the different types of ABA that we now have that are based on leveraging a child's strengths to target their challenge areas, all of that came about through research. Back in 2006, we had one type of ABA. We had just discrete trial training, was really not appropriate for a lot of people with autism, but that was it. Now we have many types. Now we have different medications that are in different phases of clinical trial. That's all the product of research. And if we want to continue to make progress, we have to continue to invest in research. Of course, we have to continue to invest in helping people find, navigate the service roadmap. And that is a challenge. But again, we have to be able to do more than one thing at a time. And I think it's important when you're thinking about why the Autism CARES Act matters to you to think about where we want to be in 10 years, where we could be in terms of having new types of interventions, new targeted medications. That comes from research.
Yeah, I mean,
does the bill, go ahead. Does the bill authorize anything beyond research dollars? Does it influence, for example, Medicaid policy? Does it influence housing policy in any way? Can you address that?
All of those agencies sit on the Interagency Autism Coordinating Committee. So writing the strategic plan for autism is one of the responsibilities of the IAC. But at its core, the committee is supposed to coordinate, Interagency Coordinating Committee. It's supposed to coordinate the efforts of all federal agencies that touch autism. And so that's why in the last couple of years, they've added the Department of Labor, the Department of Justice, Veterans Affairs. So yes, the bill is more than just research, but I would say right now, the big portion of the bill is the federal funding for research and also the federal funding for surveillance. So all of the CDC money comes out of this bill as well for the ADAM network, which does the every other year reports on the prevalence of autism, and it's from which we get the 1 in N number.
Let me hit that just slightly harder. The reason why people don't think the bill matters to their life is because it hasn't much mattered to their life, because it hasn't worked.
Good point.
It just, I mean,
He's right.
Everything Alison said is true in terms of there has been some research progress, and that has benefited people, but there hasn't been nearly as much research progress as there should have been or could have been. And that's why people don't see the connection, because they're right. We're trying to fix that. They should care about it because not of what it is, but because of what it can be, because of what it needs to be, right? So on the research side, research is always, irrelevant and academic until you have the breakthrough. And then it's the most important thing in your personal life. And then on the coordinating side, as I said earlier, the IACC is this sort of Frankenstein monster that we had to agree to because it was the best we could get. So all of these agencies send a middle-level official who knows nothing about autism, and in most cases cares nothing about autism, and they come to meetings and they check off the box, but there's no authority. And in government, without authority and money, nothing happens. If our bill passes, that will change, because the structure will change. There will be authority and money of a national autism policy director who will be able to say to these folks, here's what you have to do. So what we're trying to do is make the bill relevant in the way that it was originally intended to, and in the way it can be, if Congress gets it right.
Got it. Let's move on to some of these questions. Some really good questions have come in. You talked about Robert Titus's asking about, whether or not the profound autism movement is threatening this bill.
Yeah.
So if you, I will move on from that. If you have any more comments, feel free to weigh in.
Let me just comment really quickly about the notion that that we're somehow fracturing the community. This is a fractious community. It always has been. It has a number of different strains of thought, and that's all fine. There's nothing wrong with that. What's necessary is for Congress to have a little bit of a spine, right? And to say, we may not be able to make everybody happy, but what we can do is to address different needs, as we said earlier, different needs appropriately, and put together a package of policy that benefits different parts of the community. That's what makes most sense from a policy point of view. It's also what makes most sense politically.
When we talk about the Autism CARES Act, the Combating Autism Act, the thing that really occurs to me, pardon my allergies, is that we know it's been a failure because autism over the course of the Autism CARES Act has increased in prevalence probably 20-fold. And we still don't have answers about why this is happening. We still don't have answers about really meaningful prevention or treatment. So we know it has failed. The data is clear that it has failed. You would think that we would want to take a fresh approach and start again and take a more have a spine, take a more serious approach. But let's go on. Britta says, how can I help? And go ahead and let people know what's coming down the pike in terms. I mean, you already mentioned reaching out to their representatives,
but not yet.
But not yet. Yes. What's important is that people who want to help make their information available to the Profound Autism Alliance, to your organization, Jill, so that there are lists that we can activate when, as Alison said, when we decide that for some reason, the congressman from Montana is very important at that moment, we need to know who's with us in Montana. And if we can look that up and say, okay, there's, there's 5 people who can make a call and write a letter, that's needs to be ready to be activated.
Yeah, and we've cultivated a database at NCSA to do exactly that. So everybody who wants to help, thank you so much. Just sort of wait, be on call. We will definitely be in touch with you. Okay, Jackie asked such a good question, which is, what guardrails have you considered requesting if you are able to get an Office of Autism Policy Research in the White House, or Office of Autism Policy in the White House? I guess either one. Is there a concern if it was created that it could also be emboldening those who would drown out the debilitating side of autism, which seems to be the theme at the federal level these days?
So yes, the bill as we are writing it will require specific focus both at the NIH and at the White House on profound autism. Now, again, that's not to the exclusion of other issues and other folks, but there will be a legal requirement to address the issues related to profound autism. So it simply won't be lawful, it won't be possible for these bodies to do what's been done informally in the existing structure.
Okay. Britta says the neurodiversity community is excluding those with the greatest need. There is always a hierarchy within the disability community. And yeah, somebody mentioned, I think it was Robert, the federally funded advocates and the federally funded agencies, that have been strongly influenced and strongly amplify voices of the neurodiversity community. It is quite stunning to see how systematically, the people with the most severe needs are marginalized. And I agree with you, Britta. What can I say? Okay, Michelle, I don't have a question, but I agree 100%. The most profoundly disabled are left behind in every sense, especially medical care. It's a 2+ year waiting list here in the state of Pennsylvania for those with profound autism that need sedation and anesthesia. Whoa, I assume that's for dentistry, or I don't know what procedures.
Or inpatient
wow.
psychiatric. I mean, one thing
Yeah.
where there's been almost no research funding is understanding when our children need inpatient psychiatric services and what services they need when they are finally admitted. So many families that I talk to have children in crisis, and there's just not the infrastructure in place. That has to be built. And research has to be done about the best practices to support those children when they are finally able to receive inpatient care. So that I totally agree.
People asking how can we help, and you already heard that. John Gilmore asks, is the white paper public? And where can they get it, Alison?
We haven't posted it, right? But we certainly can. I mean, it's public in the sense that when you share something on Capitol Hill, it's pretty much open season. So I mean, that we can make that available.
Yeah, and we want it to be shared. I mean,
Yeah.
we wanted to have a coming out party. We want people to know that we will not be silent anymore, and that we are a force to be reckoned with. That yes, we've been silent for years because we have spent all of our time and our energy at home taking care of our children who have these tremendous needs, children who cannot speak for themselves, who cannot, and whose parents don't even have the time to go to policymaking committees or be on TV or or comment because they're so busy providing care.
Absolutely.
But that has been to our detriment. And we are going to have to find more time in our day to devote to this, which is as important a part of taking care of our children as being at the point of care. Otherwise,
Are
they will
you,
remain left behind.
can you post the white paper on the ASF
Yeah,
website? I mean, we could do it on the NCSA website, one or the other, both.
yeah,
Yeah.
we can post it. Once you give it out in Congress, and we sent it to other advocacy organizations that are interested in the straight dates and dollars reauthorization, because we want them to know it's not going to be smooth sailing, that we are going to be disruptive.
And by the way, if you're interested in NCSA's take on this, and it is, of course, supportive of ASF, it's on our blog. You can also, there's a link to it from our homepage, so you can see our statement on it. And it incorporates much of what ASF has advocated for. Okay, some people asking just some pragmatic questions. How do we get on a mailer or list? If you're on the NCSA list, you can sign up at the very top of our homepage. We will definitely be sending out updates about this. ASF, is there a sign up for your newsletter on your website, Allison?
You can sign up for our newsletter, but most of the advocacy work, we are working in partnership with, NCSA, on which I'm proud to serve on the board, and also with the Profound Autism Alliance, which Judith Orsini, who is the founder and president of that organization, has a lot of experience lobbying. So those are the two groups that are making the lists, and we are working in other areas of getting this bill done.
Okay, Cynthia asks, which committees will it go to?
So in the House, it's the Energy and Commerce Committee Subcommittee on Health. Don't ask me why there's a health committee that is a subcommittee to Energy and Commerce, but that's what it is. And in the Senate, it's called the HELP Committee, Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions. So those are the two committees.
Robert asks, who appoints the IACC members?
So the way the bill is written, the members are appointed by the Secretary of Health, but that's not really what happens. Basically, the Office of Autism Research Coordination now receives applications. People now lobby to get on the IAC. It's become a whole politicized activity to get on there. It's I mean, when they have a new IAC each year, when the bill's been reauthorized and they reconstitute the IAC, they've done a public call for applications and hundreds of people apply. But the most of the public spots are taken or have been taken by self-advocates.
All right, so this is a mom, Sheena, who is just saying, decrying and lamenting, the state of things in the autism world, that resources are so limited. We're suffering staffing shortages. We have a low supply of psychiatrists and therapists, direct support staffs. Adult group homes are closing. The rates of autism are rising exponentially. We can't catch up. A lot of research needs to be done on prevention. She mentions, stem cell research, but we need funding. So I think she didn't really have a question, but she's sort of like everyone in America who's like, oh my God, we are being really flooded by autism, and we are suffering a massive shortage in terms of infrastructure that we need to reasonably respond to their intensive needs. And that should be obvious to everyone. It always amazes me that it's not obvious to everyone. I joined late, says Shan. Will anything in this bill actually directly help adults who have, profound severe autism?
Yes.
Actually directly help. Well,
Well, yes. I think first being recognized as a legitimate group that should not be left behind, being allowed, first of all, to even participate in research. Because Shan, one thing we talked about was at the NIH, in order to participate in research, you have to have IQ over 70. And by definition, people with profound autism have IQ under 50. And then, of course, there's a huge number of people who have IQ between 50 and 70, for whom no research is currently being done. They are not allowed to participate in research. So none of the findings even apply to them. So one goal is to have them be included. The second is to have research that's specifically targeted at understanding the causes of profound autism and developing treatments that are appropriate for people with profound autism. There's a lot of the research that's being done now on interventions are being done on, what are the best practices for interventions to improve how well you do on a job interview? What are the best interventions for how to talk to your boss about accommodations you need in the workplace? My daughter's she's not going to work at Microsoft. She doesn't know what Microsoft is, let alone try to get a job at Microsoft. Our goals for her are far more focused on her health and her safety. And so the types of even intervention studies that need to be funded are those that are directly relevant to people with profound autism. So yes.
Very good. Okay, we have about 12 more minutes, so let's cruise through these. Mahesh says, I feel progress in Neuralink by Elon Musk could be a game changer for severely autistic people. Might be a little early to say, but let's hope for innovation. Cindy Wall, who are the loudest voices and agencies that are listened to? ASAN, others?
I mean, ASAN is one. I think when we passed the Combating Autism in 2006, there was no inclusion of autistic people themselves, right? So I think there was a necessary course correction to include people who themselves have autism. The problem is that it has gone too far in the other direction. And now we need a course correction to bring it back to the middle so that everyone on the autism spectrum is included. So yes, ASAN has been a powerful voice, but they've been a powerful voice because they used their voice. And that's what we have to do now. We have to use
They have a voice.
Yeah. We have to use the voice. We have to be the voices for our children, many of whom have no voice. And we have to insist that lived experience, that term lived experience, includes the lived experience of people with profound autism whose experience is communicated by their parents. They have to be counted.
Justine says, as a pediatric nurse, I can speak to the crisis and the children getting stuck in hospitals with little to no treatment because of the lack of research and resources. We hear about this all the time. I think the problem is intensifying. They end up in the ER and the hospitals with nowhere to go because what did Alison say? Where are the inpatient treatment units, to serve this growing population? All right. And then Michelle, referring to something from earlier, says, yes, dental. We're talking about anesthesia, sedation. This is quite a bit to take in. We have 19-year-old identical twins with profound ID, intellectual disabilities, level 3 autism, and multiple medical issues. And she's on a 2-year waiting list to get help for her kids. And that is insane. That is completely unacceptable. Michelle, you have my sympathies. And, we need urgency about this. And what amazes me about every IAC meeting, which I have the misfortune to actually watch, is there's no sense of urgency about the autism calamity, that is occurring in America. I see it as a national emergency, a matter of national security, a threat to our economy, a threat to our families. We're seeing 3% of all kids with autism, 5% of boys in America now having autism. This is a huge issue. And do we get a sense of the enormity of it at the IACC? Not at all. Not one bit. So Michelle, I'm so sorry, but it's emblematic of what's happening on a broader scale. Okay, Robert says that LEND promotes knowledge of IDD with healthcare professionals through training and certification by centers of excellence.
I apologize. I misspoke about LEND earlier. I apologize. I was thinking of a different network.
Yeah, I couldn't remember.
I'm sorry.
John says, what is the position of other supposedly neutral autism advocacy organizations, such as Autism Society of America and Autism Speaks, in the effort to change the CARES Act in the way that you advocate? Good question, John.
I mean, my feeling, and I hope I'm wrong about this, but just from having talked to them, is that there's interest in getting a bill. there's more interest in getting a bill than in getting what I would consider to be the right bill. Do you want to add to that, Craig?
I think that what happens in the lobbying congressional industrial complex is that people become invested in whatever the status quo is, and they're and they people don't want to lose their investment. So I think Alison is exactly right. The sort of mainstream major autism organizations do not want to have this be a sort of commotion, because they fear that that could lead to the bill not being reauthorized, which they would count as as a failure. I think they're for all the reasons we've talked about, they're wrong about that as a matter of substance.
But I also think that they care about what their constituents think.
Right.
And to the extent that those of you on this call are involved with those organizations, please share your thoughts with them and let them know that the current bill as is doesn't meet the needs of your children, and that change needs to be made, and that they should support that change.
Very good. Jackie reminds everybody that on a related issue, not totally related to what we're talking about today, but it is an outgrowth of the IACC, the NIH has requested public comment about co-occurring conditions with autism. That's open until next Wednesday. If you go to the NCSA blog, it's linked from the homepage. You can see our comments on it. It also has a link to the portal. So if that is of interest to you, please do it. Thank you for reminding us, Jackie. Robert says IACC membership selection has to be changed in the new bill. Otherwise, nothing will change.
Yeah, I think to the point you made earlier, Jill, the conversations that take place at the IAC now are a function of the members of the IAC. I think it would be a different conversation if there was different membership.
So
what's interesting is, yeah, go ahead.
I mean, our proposal is to abolish the IACC and replace it with a formal Office of Autism Research. So you would not have this, sort of, it's the difference between the United Nations General Assembly and the United Nations Security Council. One is a debating society, and the other has the power to do things. We're trying to create a Security Council model, not, and get rid of this sort of debating society.
Yeah, good point. Robert Klein asks, are major centers like Kennedy Krieger or Marcus or others weighing in?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Yeah, not yet, but it's not a mystery. They will weigh in on the side of the status quo because they get money from the status quo. It's just that simple.
Yes, there's a lot of that in autism. There's a lot of sort of protecting their grants, and their grants are more important than actually advancing research.
But I also think that many of the research institutions have heard the neurodiversity community call to abolish all spending for research and to divert all of the IAC, all of the funds to services.
Services, right.
And I think that's how we can engage with them when the time comes. I think they don't want to see that. So I think we'll have to be strategic in saying this is in your economic interest. It's also in our interest, but you don't want a bill that eliminates funds for research.
4 more minutes, so I'm going to boogie through some of these. Sorry. If our children who have profound autism are left out of research and the treatment options based on having an IQ under 70, is that not discrimination based on intellectual disability? Isn't that illegal? Not all research, excludes people with IQs under 70. Not all of it. Let's be clear. But anyway, you can talk to that, the bias generally, Alison.
I have heard everything from they can't properly consent because they have intellectual disability, and apparently even children who are under guardianship, where their parents can consent for everything else, can't consent to having them participate in research. I've heard it's too difficult to have profoundly autistic children participate because they can't sit still in the scanner. We don't know if they're just what they're saying. You know, every excuse under the sun. So what we need is funding specifically for this population. At the Autism Science Foundation, we have now, for the last 2 years, funded Profound Autism pilot grants, which is funding for research that is specifically for profound autism. So, you know, you must have IQ under 70 in order to participate in these projects. But that's what we need federal funding for. You know, we don't have as much money as the federal government. So we need federal research money to go towards understanding this population.
Jennifer says, as an early childhood special education teacher in Kansas, the waiver list is 9 years. Evaluations wait list is several months. Oh, that's all? Because I've heard even worse wait lists for evaluations these days. I see families desperate for assistance. Yes, you do. There are more and more families that are absolutely desperate, and there are very few resources. And this should be the absolute focus of our federal efforts. And it's not exactly getting there. Okay, let's see. Not a question, but I was surprised by the statement. Quote from Kaiser primary care physician: "We have nothing in adult medicine for autism." Oh, well, I've actually faced that where I was in a medical system and they're like, no, we have no one who can take your son. So I think that's pretty common. Comments on that?
Needs to change. That's the comment.
Exactly.
What chance of success of getting a new bill do you estimate? Asks Nicholas.
Well, you know, crystal balls are in short supply, but I will say this: when Alison and others worked on this bill originally back in 2006, there are moments in Washington. It happens every once in a while where something goes from being impossible to being inevitable, and it's just a shift in the political wind. And it is, I can't give you a percentage, but I'll tell you that it is our intention to make that happen here.
And in our last minute, I'm just going to go to the last question. Is dividing the AST spectrum back up imperative to combat vocal advocates being the only voices heard? You know, back to the question about, you know, reforming the DSM-5, which is outside of the parameters of what I think this bill can do. The DSM-5 is the creature of a private professional organization, the American Psychiatric Association. Would you like to speak to that at all?
I mean, I will. I mean, this bill is one of our efforts to focus on the needs of people with profound autism. Another area would be to get profound autism into the DSM, to get an ICD-11 code for profound autism. The current situation, autism spectrum disorder diagnosis, does not serve those with the most profound needs. I mean, we see that over and over and over, and it has had all manner of repercussion in terms of research, in terms of services, in terms of all the wait lists that people are writing about in their Q&A, in terms of psychiatric inpatient. If you can even get in, what happens when you get in? No one knows what to do with you when you finally get in. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done. But I think where we can agree is that the current situation does not serve our children, that the current Autism CARES Act does not serve our children. The current autism spectrum disorder diagnosis with everyone under the singular umbrella does not serve our population for the same reason, because our children are left behind. Their voices are drowned out by the loud voices of the neurodiversity community. And unless our children are, unless there's a specific call out for this population of people with profound autism in the CARES Act, in the DSM, in the ICD-11, they will not, no one will consider their needs. It's
Thank you.
really reminiscent to back in 2006 when we were just fighting for autism to be recognized, right? No one wanted to say that autism should be carved out, as Craig was referring to in the beginning of this webinar, that there was pushback against having a single disease bill. Now, yeah, there's pushback to having profound autism be called out, but that is what is necessary. That is the in my opinion, the only thing that is going to provide research and services for our population. If we
Last question,
specifically require it by law.
Very good. Last question is, are you seeking a specific authorization amount? Some, I don't remember what the last CARES Act authorized in terms of money. I'm blanking on it.
Our preliminary and maximum request is a doubling of existing authorization level.
What is the existing? I'm sorry.
Well, it's not one number. It's different numbers in different sections of the bill. It adds up to approximately $1.5 billion a year.
Our argument is that our children have been left behind for years, and there's some catch-up money that needs to be applied there.
So $1.5 billion would be your recommendation, not what's currently. No. Okay, sorry.
Currently
1.5. Okay.
Value. But that's over 4 years.
Over 4 years. Yeah, that's why I'm like, I can't do the math in my head.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm sorry. It's actually over 5 years. Oh, sorry. But we are asking for a doubling of that.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much. So informative. I hope that everybody on this webinar learned something and is motivated to help out as this whole drama unfolds in Washington and in your congressional district. Next week, the webinar features me and Dr. Walter Zaharodny from Rutgers University. We are going to be talking about something that very much dovetails with what we were talking about today, which is the incredible escalation in autism rates over the past 30 plus years. We will have more slides, more data than any head can possibly absorb, but hopefully it will really provide context for why change is so important. So please tune in. And I always get these questions. Is this going to be recorded? Are we going to post it? Yes, this has been recorded. It will be posted today or tomorrow, and it will also appear on our podcast. So we're double dutying this webinar. Thank you so much. Any last words before we bid our friends adieu?
Just thank you and our whole group.
I want to thank you, Jill, for hosting these webinars. They're incredibly informative. I've been on many of them. And I also want to thank everyone who participated today. And I want to thank you in advance, because a lot of this I have learned in dealing with Washington is a lot of hurry up and wait. There's nothing. And then you must act within the next hour. So one of our goals today was to get everyone up to speed on what's happening, because when the time comes to act, we're not sure which state it'll be in. But it'll need to happen fast. So we hope that we can count on all of you to be supportive, to write those letters, to make those calls when the time comes. So thank you in advance for that work.
Thanks. And you got lots of thanks in the Q&A box as well. So very nice to know that there are like-minded people out there, and we will definitely be in touch. Please get on our email list if you are not yet. So thank you and good night, everybody. Thanks for tuning in to Autism Confidential. If you'd like to learn more, share an idea for an episode, or become a sponsor, please visit us at autismconfidential.org. The views expressed in this podcast are solely those of the individual speakers. Content presented is for informational purposes only, and we do not provide any medical or legal advice.